In studying American Sign Language, you have to realize that ASL does not exist alone. In fact, there are whole families of signed languages. The British Empire spread all over the world, and as a result, it brought British Sign Language to various places. These places as diverse as Australia, India, and the United States for a time shared certain features of sign language. Even today, Australian Sign Language, Indian Sign Language, and British Sign Language bear a huge similarity. In fact, most linguists consider Auslan, or Australian Sign Language, to be a dialect of BSL, or British Sign Language, because the two languages are so similar. Now, ASL has a different story. In the monasteries of Spain, the monks who took vows of silence developed a way of communicating one another using a system of signs. As a result, some of them taught deaf children to read and write, and of course their catechism, in sign language. One of these types of monastic sign traveled to France and eventually was used in a school for the deaf in Paris, France. That's where Laurent Clerc came from to come to the United States with Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet to teach sign language. Gallaudet, a hearing person, didn't know sign, went in search of a teacher of sign and found Laurent Clerc, a deaf person, and had brought him to the U.S. And thus French Sign Language spread in the U.S. at the original School for the Deaf, the American Asylum for Deaf Mutes. There were already some older signs here in the colonies and the states at the time. Again, some of that probably had some influence from British Sign Language, as well as perhaps some signs that were particular to the United States. But by and large, it was the French system of sign that came down. Thus, even today, ASL bears more in common with Mexican Sign Language and Russian Sign Language than it does with British Sign Language. In fact, has a great deal more grammatical and lexical similarities to these sign languages that came from Old French than it does to the signs that came from Old British Sign Language. In Asia, Japan and the Japanese system of educating the deaf had a huge influence. So Old Japanese Sign Language spread to Japan, to Taiwan, to parts of Southeast Asia, and had a big influence. Sometimes the sign systems from colonial powers in Europe came and merged with the Japanese sign systems to form various families. Thus, we need to be careful when talking about sign language because there are really various sign languages, and sometimes the way that we speak creates confusion. We say things like Spanish Sign Language. Well, that only means the sign language used in Spain. That doesn't mean the sign language used in Puerto Rico, which is ASL, or the sign language used in Colombia, which is Colombian Sign, or the sign language used in Mexico, which is LSM, Mexican Sign Language. So you have to be really careful about the way that we use these terms because it doesn't recognize that these are different languages with different signs and different grammatical structures. That said, there is a form of signing that is widely used throughout the world called international sign. Now, international sign does not replace the sign language of each individual country. But at large deaf events, such as the World Federation of the Deaf's conventions, various deaf sporting events, such as Deaf Olympics, international sign is used as a sort of lingua franca, a common shared language. Now, I use that term language with scare quotes because it's debatable whether or not international sign deserves the title of language. It's certainly something that's language-like. There are a small number of signs that are used repeatedly and that everyone understands, that uses international sign understands. There are grammatical features such as the various types of directional verbs and classifiers that get used. There are common grammatical forms such as use of token space, use of surrogacy, direct dialogue, that make international sign quite easy for many users to understand. That said, international sign relies heavily on ASL because lots of deaf people go to Gallaudet and learn ASL. It relies heavily on English. Lots of the mouth movements you'll see in International Sign are based on English words. And apart from English and ASL, it relies heavily on European influences. So you'll see signs that relate to European signs for things. A signer from Africa would have a much harder time understanding International Sign. A signer from Asia would likewise have a lot more trouble because the signs are based around French-based and European-based signs, not based around Japanese-influenced and Asian-influenced signs. As a result, we need to be careful about thinking of International Sign as just this system of sign that everyone understands, and think of it more as a lingua franca used primarily with those people who are familiar with European issues and European deaf communities.